Between 1857 and 1859, 12 wealthy landowners vanished without trace from the cypress swamps surrounding what locals still call the forgotten parishes of southern Louisiana. Their bodies were never found by authorities, though rumors persisted among the enslaved population about a man who dug graves before death arrived to claim its victims. Court records from Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes, recently uncovered in water-damaged archives, reveal that investigators questioned a freedman cemetery worker named Solomon Thibodeau 17 times before abruptly closing all inquiries in March 1860. The official explanation cited migration to Texas territories, despite evidence that none of the missing men had liquidated their substantial holdings or informed their families of departure. What those brittle documents don't mention, but what whispered accounts from descendants of the enslaved still preserve, is that Solomon knew exactly where those 12 men rested, because he'd measured each man for his final resting place while their hearts still beat. Before we continue with the story of Solomon Thibodeau and the graves that shouldn't have been dug, I want to ask you something important. If you're drawn to stories that uncover the darkest chapters of American history, the kind that textbooks conveniently forget, then subscribe to Liturgy of Fear right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these forgotten terrors. And tell me in the comments, what state or city are you listening from? I want to know where in America people still remember that history's deepest graves hold its ugliest truths. What makes Solomon's story particularly disturbing isn't just the number of victims, but the calculated patience of his method. A patience born from years of being forced to wait, to bow, to dig. The sugar parishes of Louisiana's Bayou country in the late 1850s existed in a world apart from the rest of America. While northern states debated abolition in heated congressional sessions and southern cities like Charleston and New Orleans maintained polished veneers of gentility, the isolated plantation territories stretching between Bayou Lafourche and Bayou Terrebonne operated under their own brutal logic. Here, sugar was king, and the cane fields demanded blood. Terrebonne Parish had been carved from the Houma tribal lands in 1822. Its borders defined more by navigable waterways than any surveyor's precision. By 1857, the parish contained 43 major sugar plantations, each one a kingdom unto itself, separated by miles of impassable marsh and thick stands of cypress hung with Spanish moss that blocked out the sun even at midday. The nearest substantial town was Thibodeau, a muddy collection of warehouses and merchant houses serving the plantation trade, where factors negotiated sugar prices and slave traders conducted their business in back rooms of the Bayou Hotel. The land itself seemed designed to keep secrets. Cypress knees jutted from black water like rotted teeth. Alligators lay motionless in the shallows, indistinguishable from logs until they moved. The air hung thick enough to chew, especially during the grinding season from October through December, when smoke from the sugar mills mixed with fog rolling off the Gulf to create a gray soup that muffled sound and made everything more than 20 feet away disappear into shadow. Men who didn't know these swamps could walk in circles for days before dying of exposure or becoming food for creatures that left no bones behind. Into this isolated world, Solomon Thibodeau had been born in 1817, the son of a Creole freedman father and an enslaved mother on the Devereux plantation. His status had always existed in that precarious space between slavery and freedom, legally free through his father's status, but tied to the land through his mother's bondage and the parish's unwritten rules about what a man of color could and couldn't do. He'd learned the gravedigger's trade from his father, Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, who'd held the position of cemetery keeper for 3 parishes before him. The elder Thibodeau had taught his son that dignity could be found even in death, that preparing a proper resting place was sacred work. Solomon had taken these lessons to heart, developing a reputation for graves that never flooded despite the high water table, for wooden markers that lasted through hurricane seasons, for small kindnesses toward the bereaved that cost him nothing but meant everything. By the time Solomon reached 40 years of age, he was the only gravedigger most people in Terrebonne and La Fourche parishes had ever known. He dug for everyone: white families in the parish cemetery behind St. Joseph's Church, freedmen in the smaller burial ground near Bayou Black, and enslaved people in unmarked plots scattered across plantation lands. Solomon stood just under 6 feet tall, unusual height for a man of that era, with shoulders broadened by decades of digging in Louisiana's unforgiving soil. His face had weathered into hard plains, dark skin stretched tight over high cheekbones, eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He wore the same clothes year-round: canvas trousers, a homespun shirt in gray or brown, and a wide-brimmed palmetto hat that shadowed his features. Around his neck hung a small leather pouch containing graveyard dirt from his father's burial site, the only piece of sentimentality he allowed himself. What made Solomon valuable to the parish wasn't just his skill with a spade, but his silence. He heard everything whispered over open graves: confessions, accusations, family secrets spilled in grief's unguarded moments, and he never repeated a word. This discretion, this absolute reliability, had made him indispensable. Plantation owners trusted him to prepare burial sites on their lands. Widows confided in him. Even the parish priest, Father Etienne Boudreau, relied on Solomon to maintain the church cemetery with minimal supervision. But Solomon had another reputation among the enslaved population, one the white families never knew about. He was a man who could read and write, skills taught to him by his father and carefully hidden from white scrutiny. He was a man who knew every path through the swamps, every dry island in the marsh, every route that could move someone from plantation to plantation without using roads. He was a man who listened with that silent intensity of his while enslaved people spoke of unspeakable things done to their bodies, their families, their spirits. And he remembered every word, filed away behind those eyes that looked through people like they were already dead. The 12 men who would eventually vanish had this in common. They were all plantation owners of substantial holdings. They all worked enslaved people in their sugar and cotton fields, and they all shared a particular cruelty that went beyond the everyday violence of slavery. These were men who burned families at the whipping post for entertainment, who broke bones as casually as other men swatted flies, who treated human beings like equipment to be used up and replaced. Jacques Devereux owned 2,400 acres along Bayou La Fourche, and 127 enslaved people. He'd inherited the land from his father, but earned his reputation through his own innovations in discipline, including a punishment he called the mercy of the sun, which involved staking people face up in the cane fields during July, with their eyelids sewn open. Only 3 of the 17 people he'd subjected to this torture had survived with their eyesight intact. Émile Broussard ran a smaller operation, 800 acres, 43 enslaved people, but compensated for his lesser holdings with greater cruelty. He rented out his male slaves to other plantations for breeding purposes and took personal interest in the process, observing to ensure his property performed adequately. Women who resisted or whose children were born too light-skinned for Broussard's comfort simply disappeared into the swamp, their deaths attributed to running away. Augustin Landry styled himself a gentleman planter, affecting European fashions and hosting elaborate dinner parties at his plantation house, Oak Haven, where he served imported French wine and discussed philosophy with visiting factors. But his enslaved people knew him as the man who kept an iron collar in his office, a collar with inward-pointing spikes that prevented the wearer from lying down or turning their head. He'd forced people to wear this collar for weeks at a time, for infractions as minor as breaking eye contact too slowly. The others followed similar patterns, men who'd grown wealthy on sugar and cotton and human misery, who treated Louisiana's isolation as license for atrocities that might have drawn attention even in other parts of the Deep South. They represented the worst of a system that was itself built on horror. Men who found ways to be monstrous even in a time and place that normalized monstrosity. Solomon had dug graves for their victims, quiet graves in unmarked plots, Bodies buried at night without ceremony or record, deaths explained away as accidents or disease or running away. He'd lowered children into the earth, their small bodies broken by punishment or overwork. He'd prepared resting places for women who'd birthed too many babies or the wrong color baby, or who'd simply looked at an overseer the wrong way. He'd covered over the evidence of hundreds of murders committed legally under slavery's protection. And he'd said nothing, done his job. Accepted his payment, usually a few coins, sometimes a ham or a bolt of cloth, once a pair of boots that had belonged to a dead man. He'd tipped his palmetto hat and thanked the white families for the work, and walked back through the dark to his small cabin on the edge of the Devereux property, where he lived alone with his silence and his memories and something else that had been growing inside him like a cancer for 4 decades. By the summer of 1857, something in Solomon had calcified into decision. Later, when investigators tried to piece together what had happened, they'd search for a triggering incident, some particular atrocity that finally pushed Solomon past his breaking point. They never found one, because there wasn't one. There were only the accumulated years, the mountains of the dead, the memories of their faces before he'd shoveled dirt over them forever. What happened next would baffle authorities precisely because it seemed so impossible. How could one aging freedman, without accomplices, without leaving evidence, without anyone even suspecting until it was too late, eliminate 12 men who held absolute power in their small kingdoms? The answer lay in the thing that had made Solomon valuable in the first place. People trusted the Gravedigger. After all, everyone eventually needed his services, and Solomon had spent 40 years learning exactly how to put a man in the ground so that he'd never be found again. The disappearance of Jacques Devereux on August 3, 1857, initially drew little attention because plantation owners frequently traveled between properties, visited New Orleans for business, or journeyed to northern cities during the summer heat. What made his absence gradually noteworthy was the complete lack of preparation for such travel. No instructions left for his overseer, no notification to his factor in Thibodeau, no word to his wife Celeste, who discovered her husband missing when she woke to an empty bed at dawn. Celeste Devereux had summoned the overseer, Bernard Hébert, who organized a search of the plantation grounds. They found Jacques' horse still in its stall, his riding clothes hanging in his dressing room, his wallet containing $200 in banknotes sitting on his desk. What they didn't find was any sign of struggle, forced entry, or disturbance in the house or grounds. Jacques Devereux had simply ceased to exist somewhere between retiring to his bedroom at 11 o'clock and sunrise. The parish sheriff, a thick-necked former slave catcher named Luther Pruitt, had conducted a cursory investigation. He'd questioned the house servants, inspected the property, and concluded that Devereux had likely left on some personal business he'd preferred to keep private. Perhaps a gambling debt or a woman in New Orleans. Such things weren't discussed in polite society, but were understood by men of the world. The sheriff's investigation had lasted less than 3 days before he'd declared the matter closed, pending Devereux's return. What Sheriff Pruitt hadn't known was that Jacques Devereux had kept an appointment the evening before his disappearance, an appointment arranged through a note delivered by Solomon Thibodeau 3 days earlier. The note, written in careful script on cheap paper, had requested Devereux's presence at the old cemetery near Bayou Black to discuss a matter of urgent importance regarding property boundaries and burial rights. The note had been signed by Theodore Arsenault, an elderly freedman who owned a small plot of land adjacent to the cemetery and had been engaged in a boundary dispute with Devereux for years. Devereux had shown the note to no one. He'd ridden out alone after dinner, telling his wife only that he needed to inspect something on the property. He'd taken a lantern, but no weapon, seeing no need for protection when meeting an old man about a land dispute. The cemetery near Bayou Black dated back to the 1790s, one of the oldest burial grounds in the parish, serving freedmen and enslaved people whose families could afford markers. Spanish moss hung so thick from the surrounding cypress trees that moonlight barely penetrated. The graves lay scattered without apparent order, some marked by wooden crosses, others by simple stones, many completely sunken and reclaimed by the earth. The living rarely visited after dark. Solomon had been waiting among the graves when Devereux arrived, a darker shadow among shadows. He'd stepped forward into the lantern light slowly, unthreatening, his palmetto hat held respectfully in his hands. "Mr. Devereux, sir. Thank you for coming. Mr. Arsenault, he's running late, but he asked me to show you the boundary line in question while we wait." Devereux had frowned, irritated but not alarmed. He'd known Solomon for decades, trusted him the way one trusts any reliable servant. "Be quick about it, I don't have all night." Solomon had led him deeper into the cemetery, weaving between graves, moving with the confidence of a man who'd memorized every inch of this ground. He'd stopped near the far edge, where the cemetery met the swamp, and pointed to a line of stones barely visible in the undergrowth. "The dispute is here, sir. Mr. Arsenault claims the boundary runs along this line, but your deed suggests it's 30 feet further into the cemetery. I've prepared a test excavation to settle the matter. If we find bedrock at the depth indicated in your deed, it proves your claim." What seemed like efficient problem-solving to Devereux was actually something else entirely. Solomon had indeed dug a hole, 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, 3 feet wide. Perfect proportions for a grave, though Devereux hadn't thought of it that way. He'd simply seen a man doing thorough work. "Show me," Devereux had commanded, stepping to the edge of the excavation. He'd held his lantern out over the hole, peering down into the darkness to see the supposed bedrock. That was the last moment of Jacques Devereux's life as a free man. Solomon had struck him from behind with a wooden shovel handle, a single calculated blow to the base of the skull, hard enough to stun but not kill, delivered with the precision of a man who understood anatomy from years of handling the dead. Devereux had dropped like a felled tree, the lantern flying from his hand to land in the soft earth. Before the plantation owner could recover his senses, Solomon had rolled him into the prepared grave. The impact of landing on hard-packed soil had expelled the air from Devereux's lungs with an audible whoosh. He'd lain stunned at the bottom of the hole, his vision swimming, unable to make his limbs work properly. Above him, Solomon's face had appeared, framed by stars and Spanish moss, utterly expressionless. "Do you know how many graves I've dug on your land, Mr. Devereux?" Solomon's voice had been conversational, almost pleasant. "I've lost count, but I remember every face, every child, every woman, every man worked to death in your fields. I remember the one you staked out in the sun with his eyes sewn open. He was 17 years old. His name was Philippe. You never asked his name." Devereux had tried to speak, to scream, but his breath came only in short gasps, his throat constricted by shock and the beginning of panic. He'd managed to roll onto his hands and knees, had tried to stand, but the walls of the grave were too smooth, the dirt too loose to find purchase. Solomon had picked up his spade and begun filling in the grave. Not quickly. There was no rush. No one would come to this cemetery after dark. But methodically, each shovelful of earth landing with a soft thump on the ground around Devereux. The plantation owner had found his voice then, had begun shouting threats, promises, pleas. He'd offered Solomon money, freedom, anything he could think of, his voice rising higher and higher until it cracked into pure animal terror. The gravedigger had continued working in silence, his face invisible in the darkness, only the rhythmic sounds of the spade biting earth and the soft impacts of soil falling marking his presence. Devereux had scrambled to his feet, pressing his back against the grave wall, had tried to climb out, but the fresh-dug earth collapsed under his weight, sending him tumbling back to the bottom. He'd tried again and again, his fine clothes becoming plastered with mud, his fingernails breaking as he clawed at the dirt, his voice becoming hoarse with screaming. The earth had risen around him slowly, inexorably. First, it had covered his feet, then his ankles, then his knees. Devereux had tried to keep pushing it back, digging himself out even as more dirt fell in, but it was impossible. One man at the bottom of a grave couldn't shovel faster than a man at the top with leverage and skill. The earth had reached his waist, then his chest, pressing against his ribs with terrible weight, making each breath harder than the last. "Please," he'd gasped. The the single word barely audible. "Please, I have a family." Solomon had paused for just a moment. So did Philippe. So did all of them. Then he'd continued filling the grave. The earth had reached Devereux's shoulders, then his neck. He'd tilted his head back, mouth gaping for air, and in those final seconds before the dirt covered his face, he'd looked up at the stars one last time and understood with perfect clarity that he was about to experience what dozens of enslaved people on his plantation had experienced: the absolute powerlessness of death at another man's hands, and the knowledge that no one would mark his passing. Remember his name with anything but relief. The dirt had covered his face. His screaming had stopped. Solomon had continued filling the grave until the hole was full, then tamped down the earth with the flat of his shovel and covered the fresh-turned soil with fallen leaves and cypress needles until the grave was invisible to any casual observer. The whole process had taken perhaps 40 minutes. Solomon had picked up Devereux's lantern, had walked to the bayou's edge, and had thrown it far out into the water, where it had sunk without trace. Then he'd walked home through the dark swamps, arriving at his cabin before midnight. He'd washed the dirt from his hands and arms, had changed his clothes, and had slept soundly for the first time in 40 years. The next morning, Solomon had appeared at the Devereux plantation as usual, had touched his hat respectfully to the overseer, and had inquired politely whether there were any graves needing to be dug. No one had thought to question the gravedigger's activities from the night before. Why would they? Solomon was as much a part of the landscape as the bayou itself, as permanent and unremarkable as the Spanish moss. When Céleste Devereux had discovered her husband missing, when the search had begun, Solomon had joined in, had walked the property with the others, had looked in all the places a man might look for someone he hoped to find. And he'd said nothing about the grave in the old cemetery, the grave that no one had any reason to examine because everyone knew what the old cemetery contained. Bones that had been there for decades, nothing new, nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating. Jacques Devereux's disappearance might have remained an isolated mystery, a rich man's unexplained absence eventually forgotten in the chaos of a nation sliding towards civil war. But Solomon Thibodeau had only just begun his work. 11 more men would receive his carefully worded notes, would keep their appointments in the dark, would find themselves at the bottom of graves they hadn't known were waiting for them. And with each disappearance, Solomon refined his method, learning from small mistakes, adjusting his approach, becoming more efficient. The second man vanished 3 weeks after the first. The third disappeared a month after that. By the time the authorities noticed the pattern, it was far too late to stop what had been set in motion. The disappearance of Émile Broussard on August 27, 1857, drew more immediate attention than Devereux's had, primarily because Broussard vanished in the middle of a business transaction with 2 cotton factors from New Orleans who'd been staying at his plantation house. The factors reported that Broussard had excused himself after dinner, claiming he needed to inspect something in one of his barns, and had never returned. His horse was found still saddled near the slave quarters the next morning, but Broussard himself had evaporated as completely as if the swamp had swallowed him whole. Sheriff Pruitt had conducted a more thorough investigation this time, questioning everyone on the Broussard plantation, including the enslaved population, searching buildings and outbuildings, dragging sections of the nearby bayou. He'd found nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The official report had concluded that Broussard had likely suffered an accident in the swamp, perhaps falling into deep water or being taken by an alligator, though the absence of any physical evidence made this explanation unsatisfying. What Pruitt hadn't discovered was that Broussard, like Devereux before him, had received a note requesting his presence at a specific location, in this case, an old sugar mill that had burned down 15 years earlier and whose ruins still stood on the edge of Broussard's property. The The note had supposedly come from one of his enslaved workers requesting permission to hold a secret wedding ceremony in the ruins, and had promised to reveal which other slaves were planning to marry without permission. For a man like Broussard, who took personal interest in controlling every aspect of his human property's lives, such information was irresistible. Solomon had waited for him in the ruins, where blackened timbers jutted from the earth like broken ribs, and the smell of old smoke still lingered in the bricks. He'd prepared a grave beneath a collapsed section of floor, where burned boards concealed fresh excavation. The method had been the same: a blow from behind, a long fall into darkness, and then the terrible patient work of burial while the victims screamed uselessly into the night. But Broussard had been different from Devereux. Younger, stronger, more vicious. He'd fought like a wild animal at the bottom of his grave, had managed to climb halfway up the walls twice before Solomon had pushed him back down with the spade. The screaming had lasted longer. The threats had been more creative, and when the dirt had finally covered Broussard's face, the last sound he'd made wasn't a plea, but a curse. A promise that Solomon would burn in hell for this, that he'd be hunted down and skinned alive, that even death wouldn't end what would be done to him. Solomon had finished filling the grave in silence, had replaced the burned floorboards, and had walked away from that place as if nothing unusual had occurred. And once again, in the morning, he'd been the gravedigger everyone knew, the quiet man who never caused trouble and did his work without complaint. The third disappearance had been Augustin Landry, the gentleman planter who'd kept the iron collar in his office. Solomon had lured him to the parish cemetery itself, where Landry's family maintained an elaborate mausoleum, claiming there was damage to the structure that required immediate attention. Landry had come at dusk with his son Philippe, a boy of 15 who was being groomed to inherit the plantation and all its cruelties. This had presented Solomon with an unexpected complication. He'd prepared for Landry alone, not for a witness, especially not for a child. The boy had stood back while his father inspected the mausoleum, had watched Solomon with the casual indifference that wealthy white children showed toward people of color, present but invisible, as unremarkable as furniture. Solomon had been forced to make a terrible choice in that moment. He could abort the plan, let Landry leave, hope for another opportunity, or he could adapt. The boy had seen nothing yet, suspected nothing. If Solomon moved quickly enough, he could deal with Landry before young Philippe understood what was happening. But that would mean striking in front of the boy, would mean the child would see, would scream, would have to be silenced. For the first time in his carefully planned campaign, Solomon had hesitated. This wasn't part of what he'd imagined. The 12 men on his list were monsters, but their children, however corrupted by their father's examples, were still children. To kill a boy who'd barely begun to shave seemed to cross a line that even righteous vengeance shouldn't breach. But then Philippe Landry had spoken. The boy had picked up one of the flowers left on a nearby grave, had examined it with idle curiosity, and had said to his father, "Papa, do you think the colored ones put flowers on graves because they think it makes a difference? As if flowers could make them more than animals." Augustin had laughed, a warm, paternal sound. "It's instinct, son, like a dog that scratches at the earth. They mimic what they see us do without understanding the meaning. When you take over the plantation, you'll learn to recognize these behaviors and use them to your advantage." Something in Solomon had gone very cold at those words. This wasn't innocence corrupted. This was corruption being taught as virtue, hatred being passed from father to son like an inheritance. Philippe Landry at 15 was already everything his father was, would grow to be worse, because he'd never known a time when such cruelty wasn't normal. Solomon had made his decision. He'd struck Augustin Landry from behind, had let the man's unconscious body fall into the prepared grave hidden behind the mausoleum. The boy had frozen for a crucial second, too shocked to process what he'd just witnessed. And in that second, Solomon had grabbed him, had covered his mouth with one large hand, and had held him still while he spoke quietly into the boy's ear. "Listen very carefully. Your father is dying right now. You can join him or you can run. If you run, you'll tell everyone what you saw, and I'll be hanged before the week is out. But if you run, your father still dies, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have saved him and chose not to. If you try to help him, I'll put you in that grave with him. Your choice. Make it now." He'd released the boy. Philippe had stood there trembling, had looked at the grave where his father was beginning to regain consciousness and groan, had looked at Solomon with his spade, had looked toward the cemetery gates and the road beyond. The calculation had been visible on his young face. What was the right choice, the brave choice, the choice that wouldn't get him killed? Philippe Landry had run. He'd sprinted for the gates without looking back, had kept running until he reached the road, and had collapsed, sobbing in the dirt a quarter-mile from the cemetery. By the time he'd made his way to the nearest plantation and stammered out his story, Solomon had finished his work and disappeared into the swamp. But the boy's testimony had changed everything. Now there was a witness, a description, a name. The authorities finally understood that Jacques Devereux and Émile Broussard hadn't suffered accidents or run off. They'd been murdered, and Solomon Thibodeau, the quiet gravedigger everyone had trusted, was the killer. Sheriff Pruitt had organized a manhunt immediately, had deputized every able-bodied white man in the parish, had offered a substantial reward for Solomon's capture. They'd searched his cabin, which had been empty and would remain empty. Solomon had prepared for this eventuality, had supplies and hiding places scattered throughout the swamp, had planned his campaign knowing that discovery was always possible. The manhunt had lasted 3 weeks, men with dogs crashing through cypress stands and dragging bayous, finding nothing. Solomon knew these swamps better than anyone, had spent 40 years learning every dry island, every hidden passage, every place a man could vanish. He'd watched the search parties from cover, sometimes passing within yards of men who'd never thought to look up into the branches above their heads. During those 3 weeks, 2 more plantation owners had disappeared, Jean-Baptiste Hébert and Charles Duplantis, both taken from their properties after dark, both buried alive in graves prepared specifically for them. The parish had dissolved into panic. Plantation families had armed themselves, had posted guards, had stopped going anywhere alone. But Solomon had proven impossible to capture, and the bodies of his victims impossible to find. Father Etienne Boudreau, the parish priest, had attempted intervention. He'd known Solomon for decades, had considered him a good man, couldn't reconcile the quiet gravedigger with the monster the authorities described. He'd walked into the swamp alone, unarmed, calling Solomon's name, offering sanctuary if he'd surrendered to the church. Solomon had met him on a moonless night at the ruins of an old trapper's cabin, had stepped out of the shadows with his hands empty and visible. "Father." "Solomon, what have you done?" The priest's voice had carried more sorrow than accusation. "They say you've murdered 5 men. Tell me it isn't true." "It's true, Father, though murder isn't the word I'd use. Execution, perhaps, or justice, or simply necessary killing, the way a farmer slaughters a rabid dog. You can't appoint yourself judge and executioner. That's God's authority, not man's. With respect, Father, God seems to have subcontracted his authority to men like Devereux and Broussard for a very long time. I'm only taking back what was his in the first place. There are laws, Solomon, courts, legal remedies for what, Father?" Solomon's voice had remained quiet, but had carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "For Jacques Devereux staking a 17-year-old boy face up in the sun with his eyes sewn open, what law punishes that? What court hears testimony from enslaved people against white men? Show me this legal remedy you speak of, and I'll lay down my spade tonight." Father Boudreau had been silent for a long moment. "You're damning your immortal soul." "My soul was damned at birth, Father. I was born into a world where men own other men, where cruelty is law, where the innocent die screaming while the righteous look away and invoke heavenly justice that never comes. If hell is waiting for me, it can't be worse than the 40 years I've already lived. What about the boy, Philippe Landry? He was innocent. I let him run, Father. He chose his father's life over his own, and then chose his own life over his father's. He'll live with that choice. Maybe it'll teach him something his father never could. Please, Solomon, surrender yourself, confess your sins, accept. I'm not finished, Father. 7 more men need to meet me in the dark. After that, I'll consider confession. Lo, Father Boudreau had tried to convince Solomon to abandon his campaign, had argued scripture and morality, and the inevitable end this path would bring. But Solomon had been unmoved, had thanked the priest for his concern, and had melted back into the darkness of the swamp. The priest had returned to town alone, had reported the meeting to Sheriff Pruitt, and had spent the rest of his life wrestling with the question of whether he should have tried harder to stop what was coming. Because Solomon was true to his word. Over the next year and a half, 7 more plantation owners would vanish into carefully prepared graves, each one taken at night, each one given time to understand what was happening to them and why before the earth closed over their screaming faces. By the end of 1857, the pattern had become undeniable, and the remaining plantation owners in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes lived in constant fear. Guards patrolled property boundaries at night. Men slept with loaded weapons beside their beds. No one traveled alone after dark. But Solomon continued his work with a patience that bordered on supernatural, waiting weeks or even months between killings, allowing the fear to settle deep into bones before striking again. The 6th victim was Narcisse Thibault, owner of Belgrove Plantation, taken in November while inspecting his sugar mill during grinding season. The 7th was Cyprien Leblanc, who'd been so paranoid about Solomon's campaign that he'd moved his entire family into Thibodeau and had hired 4 armed guards to protect his townhouse. Solomon had gotten to him anyway, through a tunnel that connected the townhouse's cellar to the old Spanish drainage system running beneath the city. A tunnel LeBlanc hadn't known existed because he'd bought the house only 3 years earlier and had never bothered to examine its full history. Each killing demonstrated Solomon's intimate knowledge of the land and its secrets. He used abandoned structures that everyone had forgotten about, natural features of the landscape that predated the plantations, and the collective amnesia of white colonizers who'd never bothered to learn the geography as thoroughly as the people who'd been forced to work it. The Houma people had lived in these bayous for centuries before the French arrived, had mapped every waterway and dry island, and some of that knowledge had been preserved and passed down among the enslaved population, shared in whispers around cooking fires, taught to children as stories about how to run when the time came. Solomon had learned this geography from his father, who'd learned it from his mother, who'd been Houma herself, before being swept up in the chaos of colonization and the blurred boundaries between native peoples and enslaved Africans in Louisiana's early days. This was knowledge that white men didn't have and couldn't buy, a map of the land that existed only in memory and practice. The authorities had brought in outside help, a professional manhunter from Mississippi named Tobias Fletcher, who'd earned a reputation tracking down escaped slaves throughout the Deep South. Fletcher had arrived in January 1858 with 6 men and a pack of trained bloodhounds, had announced his confidence that Solomon would be captured within a month, and had begun a systematic search of the swamps using methods that had never failed him before. Fletcher had lasted 3 weeks before requesting a leave of absence to recover from a mysterious illness he'd contracted in the swamps. 2 of his men had simply disappeared during night watches, their bodies never recovered. The bloodhounds had been found dead, poisoned with something that left no trace beyond the foam around their muzzles and the rigid contortion of their bodies. Fletcher himself had woken one morning to find a wooden grave marker planted outside his tent, his own name carved into it, along with a date 3 days in the future. He'd left Louisiana that same morning and had never returned. The 8th victim, taken in February 1858, was Valmont Rodrigue, who'd believed himself safe because he'd been kind to his enslaved people by the standards of the time, which meant he rarely killed them outright and sometimes let them keep Sundays to themselves. Solomon had buried him anyway because kindness measured against cruelty was still cruelty. because owning human beings could never be made gentle, no matter how one tried to polish the chains. As the months passed and the body count rose, something unexpected began happening in the enslaved communities throughout southern Louisiana. People started singing new songs, songs that didn't exist in any written collection, songs whose lyrics seemed to shift depending on who was listening. To white ears, these were spirituals about biblical deliverance, about Moses and Pharaoh, about crossing Jordan into the Promised Land. But to those who understood the code, the songs told a different story, about a man with a spade who was settling accounts, about graves prepared in advance, about how the earth eventually claims everyone, regardless of their earthly power. One song in particular had spread through the parishes with remarkable speed. Solomon dug low. Solomon dug deep. Solomon knows where the wicked men sleep. 12 holes in the ground, 12 debts to pay, Solomon working in the cool of the day. The authorities had tried to suppress these songs, had forbidden enslaved people from gathering to sing, had punished those caught teaching the lyrics to others. But the songs had persisted, had evolved, had spread like water finding cracks in stone. They'd become a form of resistance in themselves, a way of celebrating something that couldn't be celebrated openly, of expressing joy at justice being served, even if that justice existed outside any legal framework. This had terrified the plantation owners in a way that even the killings themselves hadn't, because it demonstrated that Solomon wasn't working alone in spirit, even if he worked alone in practice. He'd become a symbol, a living embodiment of vengeance that the enslaved population had dreamed about, but never dared hope for. If he succeeded, if he actually killed all 12 men on whatever list he'd made and escaped justice, what would that mean for the entire system that depended on the enslaved, believing their condition was permanent and their owners invincible? By summer 1858, several plantation owners had abandoned their properties entirely, had sold out at enormous losses and moved to New Orleans or fled Louisiana altogether. The sugar economy in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes had begun to collapse, with production down nearly 40% as plantations struggled to maintain operations while their owners cowered behind locked doors. The enslaved people still worked the fields, still cut the cane and boiled the sugar, but they worked with their heads up now, their backs a little straighter, singing those new songs that made the overseers nervous. The 9th victim was Hilaire Chauvin, taken in August while supposedly secure in a fortified plantation house surrounded by armed guards. Solomon had gotten to him through the cistern system that provided the house's water supply, had waited in the darkness beneath the house for 3 nights until Chauvin had made the mistake of checking the cistern alone after one of the guards reported an unusual smell. The grave had been waiting in the crawlspace beneath the house's foundation, and Chauvin's screams had been muffled by 10 inches of floorboards and the loud conversation of guards drinking in the parlor above, who'd assumed the sounds were rats fighting over scraps. The 10th was Octave Blanchard, who'd hired a voodoo practitioner from New Orleans to place protective spells around his property. Solomon had waited until the practitioner had finished her work and departed, had studied the pattern of candles and offerings and chalk marks she'd left, and had simply walked through them as if they weren't there. Because whatever power voodoo held, and Solomon wouldn't have disputed that it held power, it wasn't designed to protect men who'd spent their lives violating every principle of balance and respect that voodoo practitioners honored. The spirits, if they were watching, apparently had no interest in saving Octave Blanchard from his appointment with Solomon's spade. By this point, Sheriff Pruitt had been replaced. The parish had voted him out of office after his repeated failures to capture Solomon or protect the community. His replacement, a former military officer named Marcus Sutherland, had taken a different approach. Instead of trying to hunt Solomon through the swamps, he'd posted notices throughout the parishes offering complete amnesty to anyone who'd helped Solomon, provided they came forward with information. He'd promised safety, money, transportation out of Louisiana, whatever it would take to get someone to betray the Gravedigger's location. The response had been absolute silence. Not a single person had come forward, not from the enslaved population who might have seen Solomon moving through the night, not from the freedmen community who might have sheltered him, not from anyone who might have witnessed something useful. This wasn't because people didn't know things. Dozens of people had seen Solomon at various times, had shared food with him, had hidden him when searchers came too close. But the culture of silence that protected the enslaved from their owners' vengeance had been turned against the owners themselves. And no reward was worth the social death that would follow betraying a man like Solomon. Sheriff Sutherland had tried a different tactic. He'd arrested 15 people on suspicion of aiding Solomon, elderly freedmen, young men who'd been seen near places where victims disappeared, even 2 women who'd sold provisions that might have fed someone living rough in the swamps. He'd held them in the parish jail, had questioned them repeatedly, had made it clear they'd face charges of accessory to murder unless someone provided useful information. On the 3rd night of their imprisonment, Solomon had appeared in Thibodeau itself, had walked down the main street at 2 a.m, and had left a note pinned to the jail's front door. The note had been simple, and had been written in the same careful script he'd used for all his other communications. Release them. They know nothing. If you want me, Sheriff, I'll meet you at the place where you buried your shame. Come alone. Friday at midnight. If the 15 are not released by then, I'll assume you're too much of a coward, and I'll come for you the way I came for the others. The jail guard who'd found the note had immediately woken Sheriff Sutherland, who'd read it with a face that had gone pale as milk. Because Sutherland had a secret, something only a handful of people knew, something that should have been impossible for Solomon to have discovered. 7 years earlier, when Sutherland had been an overseer on a plantation in Ascension Parish, he'd killed a man during a dispute over a card game. Not a white man, that would have brought consequences, but a freedman who'd been traveling through on his way to Texas. Sutherland had buried the body himself in an unmarked grave behind an abandoned chapel, and had assumed the killing would never come back to haunt him, because no one had witnessed it, and no one had reported the freedman missing. Except someone had known. Somehow, despite all the years and distance, Solomon had uncovered this secret. And the note's phrasing, "where you buried your shame," made it clear that Solomon knew not just about the killing but about the specific location of the grave, which meant he'd been to that place, had found it, and was now using it as an invitation to a meeting that could only end one way. Sutherland had released all 15 prisoners immediately. He'd claimed publicly that there was insufficient evidence to hold them, but everyone had understood what the note had meant. The new sheriff was just as afraid of Solomon as the old one had been. The myth of Solomon's invincibility had grown with each failed attempt to catch him, until he'd seemed less like a fugitive and more like a force of nature, inevitable as a hurricane and just as impossible to negotiate with. The 11th victim had been Pierre-Auguste Comeau, taken in November 1858 from his plantation house, despite the presence of 12 armed guards stationed throughout the property. The guards had heard nothing, seen nothing, and had discovered their employer missing only when his valet had gone to wake him for breakfast and had found an empty bed and an open window. They'd searched the grounds and had found Comeau's nightshirt caught on a branch near the edge of the property, as if he'd been dragged through the gardens toward the swamp. But there had been no tracks, no signs of struggle, no blood or evidence of violence. What they hadn't found was the hidden grave beneath the plantation house's wine cellar, where Comeau lay buried under the foundation stones of his own home, his death occurring literally beneath the feet of guards who'd been hired to protect him. Solomon had used the same cistern technique he'd employed with Chauvin, had waited in the crawl space for 2 days until Comeau had made his nightly inspection of the wine stores, and had taken him in silence while the guards had played cards upstairs. This killing had broken something in the remaining plantation owner's psyche. If Solomon could reach a man inside his own house, beneath armed guards who were actively searching for threats, then no one was safe. The few owners who'd remained in the parishes through sheer stubbornness had finally accepted that Solomon would eventually come for them, and that nothing they could do would prevent it. By December 1858, only one name remained on Solomon's list: François Laviolette, owner of Beauregard Plantation, the largest landholding in Terrebonne Parish. Laviolette had been different from the other victims in one crucial way. He'd been studying Solomon's pattern for over a year, had analyzed every killing, every method, every approach, and had concluded that Solomon's greatest strength was also his weakness. Solomon was predictable in his unpredictability. He always struck when his targets felt most secure, always used the landscape itself as his weapon, always worked alone. Laviolette had decided to reverse the trap. Instead of hiding, instead of fortifying his position, he'd made himself deliberately vulnerable. He'd dismissed his guards, had stopped locking his doors at night, had taken to walking alone through his property at all hours. He'd let it be known through the community that he was tired of living in fear, that he'd accepted his fate, and that he was ready to face Solomon on whatever terms the Gravedigger chose. This was, of course, a lie. Laviolette had prepared an elaborate trap, had turned his entire plantation into a killing ground designed specifically for Solomon. Hidden pits covered with branches lay along all the paths leading to the plantation house. Tripwires connected to alarm bells ran through the gardens. Men armed with rifles hid in the slave quarters, in the barns, in the sugar mill, all positioned to converge on any location where an alarm sounded. And Laviolette himself slept with 2 loaded pistols under his pillow and a knife in his boot, ready to kill Solomon personally if the Gravedigger made it past all the other defenses. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Bayou country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Solomon's final encounter. What Laviolette hadn't considered was that Solomon had spent 15 months studying his targets just as carefully as Laviolette had studied him. Solomon knew about the hidden pits. He'd watched them being dug. He knew about the tripwires. He'd observed their installation. He knew about the armed men hiding throughout the property. He'd counted them during their shift changes. And he knew that Laviolette's apparent vulnerability was theater designed to draw him into making a fatal mistake. So Solomon had done something he'd never done before. He'd waited. For 3 months, he'd made no move against Laviolette, had allowed the Christmas season to pass, had let January and February come and go without incident. The other plantation owners were all dead or fled. The manhunt had stalled into futility, and only Solomon and Laviolette remained locked in their strange, waiting game. The inactivity had driven Laviolette nearly insane with anticipation. He'd maintained his trap for months, had kept his men hidden and ready, had walked his property each night expecting Solomon to appear from the shadows. But as weeks turned to months, his men had grown careless, had begun slipping away to sleep or drink, had convinced themselves that maybe Solomon had left Louisiana or died in the swamps. The constant vigilance had proven impossible to sustain, and by March 1859, the trap had fallen into disrepair. That was when Solomon had made his move, but not in any way Laviolette had anticipated. Instead of coming to the plantation at all, Solomon had sent Laviolette a note, delivered by a child from town who'd been paid a penny to carry it to the plantation. The note had contained an invitation. "Mr. Laviolette, your trap is very clever, but it requires me to come to you, and I see no reason to accept such an invitation. Instead, I invite you to come to me. There's someone who wants to meet you, someone you thought you'd never see again. Come to the old cemetery near Bayou Black on the night of March 19th at midnight. Come alone. If you bring others, the meeting will be cancelled, and I'll simply wait another 3 months before trying again. But I think you'll want to come, because the person waiting for you has been dead for 11 years, and she has things to tell you about the night she died." The note had referenced something that had made Laviolette's blood run cold. A young enslaved woman named Celeste, who died in 1848 under mysterious circumstances. Officially, she'd drowned while washing clothes in the bayou. Unofficially, everyone on Beauregard Plantation had known that Laviolette had gotten her pregnant, that his wife had found out, and that Celeste had disappeared the very night his wife had confronted him about it. No body had ever been found, no investigation had ever occurred, and Laviolette had told everyone that the girl had run away. But the note suggested that Solomon knew the truth, that there was a body, that there was a grave, that there was evidence that could destroy Laviolette's reputation and possibly bring legal consequences even after all these years. The promise of a meeting at the old cemetery could only mean one thing. Solomon had found Celeste's remains and was using them as bait. Laviolette had faced an impossible choice. If he went to the meeting, he was almost certainly walking into a trap. But if he didn't go, Solomon could reveal the location of Celeste's body to the authorities, could provide evidence of murder, could turn Laviolette from hunter to hunted through legal means. And there was always the possibility, however remote, that Solomon genuinely wanted to negotiate. After all, the Gravedigger had eliminated all his other targets and had spent months doing nothing. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps he wanted an end to this as much as Laviolette did. On March 19, 1859, François Laviolette had ridden to the old cemetery near Bayou Black. Despite Solomon's instructions to come alone, he'd brought a small pistol concealed in his jacket and a knife strapped to his calf. He'd arrived 15 minutes before midnight, had tied his horse to a tree outside the cemetery gates, and had walked among the graves with his hand on the pistol, every nerve screaming that this was a mistake. Solomon had been waiting for him exactly where he'd been waiting for Jacques Devereux 18 months earlier. The same clearing, the same Spanish moss-filtering moonlight, the same stillness that made every sound seem amplified. But this time, there was no pretense of diplomacy, no false story about boundary disputes. Solomon simply stood beside an open grave, his spade resting against a nearby tree, his face illuminated by a single lantern hanging from a branch. "Mr. Laviolette, thank you for coming. Where is she? Where's Celeste's body?" Solomon had gestured to the grave at his feet. "Right here. I found her 3 years ago while digging a grave for someone else. She'd been buried shallow, and the rains had exposed part of her skull. I reburied her properly at the time, but I remembered the location." Laviolette had taken a step closer, had peered into the grave, and in that moment of distraction, Solomon had moved with the speed of a man 40 years younger. He'd grabbed the lantern from its branch and had thrown it at Laviolette's feet, where it had shattered and spread burning oil across the dry leaves carpeting the cemetery floor. The flames had caught instantly, had created a wall of fire between Solomon and Laviolette, and in the sudden brightness, Laviolette had drawn his pistol and fired twice through the flames. But Solomon had already moved, had circled around through the graves, had approached from an unexpected angle, while Laviolette's attention had been fixed on the fire. What happened next had been the subject of debate for years afterward, reconstructed from physical evidence and the testimony of the one person who survived. The two men had fought among the graves, a brutal struggle between a plantation owner defending his life and a gravedigger who'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment. They'd been roughly the same age, both in their early 40s, but Solomon had carried the physical strength of 4 decades of hard labor, while Laviolette had spent the same decades growing soft on his wealth. The fight had been brief and vicious. Laviolette had managed to cut Solomon across the ribs with his knife, a wound that had bled freely but hadn't slowed the gravedigger significantly. Solomon had struck Laviolette in the throat with his fist, had crushed the smaller man's windpipe, and had let him fall gasping to the ground beside the open grave. But Laviolette hadn't fallen into the grave as the others had. He'd collapsed beside it, choking, unable to breathe, and Solomon had stood over him watching with that same expressionless face he'd worn for all the others. This moment had stretched, had extended, had given Laviolette time to understand fully what was happening, that he was dying, that he'd lost, that Solomon had won. "Celeste wasn't in that grave," Solomon had said quietly. "I lied about finding her body. I don't know where she is, and I don't need to know. Your guilt brought you here, not my evidence. You came because you knew what you'd done, and you couldn't stand the thought of someone else knowing it too. Laviolette had tried to speak, had managed only a wet, gurgling sound, as his crushed windpipe had failed completely. He'd reached up toward Solomon, whether pleading for help or trying to pull the gravedigger down with him, and Solomon had simply stepped back, had let the hand fall to the earth. You were the 12th, Solomon had continued, speaking to a man who could no longer hear him. The last one on my list. 12 plantation owners who showed cruelty beyond even what this system demands. 12 men who treated human beings as less than animals. 12 graves, each one measured exactly to fit its occupant. This is the last one I'll dig. After tonight, I'm done. Francois Laviolette had died there beside the grave meant for him, had expired from asphyxiation while his killer stood watching, and when his body had finally gone still, Solomon had rolled him into the hole and had begun the work of filling it in. But this time, something had been different. This time, Solomon had been injured, had been leaving a blood trail that any competent tracker could follow. And this time, there had been a witness. Philippe Landry, now 16 years old and nearly a man, had followed Francois Laviolette to the cemetery that night. For 18 months, ever since Solomon had given him the choice between running and dying beside his father, Philippe had been consumed by shame and guilt. He'd saved his own life by abandoning his father, had run like a coward while his father had been buried alive. And that knowledge had poisoned every moment of his existence since. He'd vowed to track Solomon down, to avenge his father, to prove that he wasn't the coward he'd been that night. He'd learned to shoot, had studied tracking, had spent months following rumors and whispers about where Solomon might be hiding. And when he'd heard about Solomon's note to Laviolette, about the planned meeting at the cemetery, he'd understood that this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to finally face the man who'd destroyed his father. Philippe had hidden at the edge of the cemetery, had watched the confrontation between Solomon and Laviolette, had seen his father's killer triumph once again. And as Solomon had begun filling in Laviolette's grave, Philippe had emerged from cover with a rifle in his hands, had sighted down the barrel at Solomon's back, and had felt his finger tighten on the trigger. But he hadn't fired. Something in the sight of Solomon working alone in the moonlight, methodically completing his final burial, had made Philippe hesitate. This wasn't the monster he'd imagined for 18 months. This was just a man, middle-aged and scarred and bleeding from a knife wound, doing the work he'd always done, digging graves, filling them in, treating the dead with a care that the living had never shown them. "You gonna shoot me, boy? Me?" Solomon hadn't turned around, had kept working with his spade, but had spoken loud enough for Philippe to hear. "That rifle makes a distinctive sound when you cock it. I've been wondering when you'd show up. You've been following me for 3 months now. Not quite close enough to do anything, but close enough to let me know you're there." Philippe had said nothing, had kept the rifle aimed at Solomon's back, had tried to summon the courage to do what he'd promised himself he'd do. But the words had stuck in his throat, and his hands had begun to shake. "Your father was Augustin Landry," Solomon had continued, still working. "Oak Haven Plantation. He kept an iron collar in his office with spikes that pointed inward, wouldn't let people rest their heads or lie down. I dug graves for 6 people who died wearing that collar. One of them was a girl, couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Your father put that collar on her because she'd looked at him wrong. She wore it for 5 weeks before she died from infection and exhaustion. My father was a respected man. Your father was a monster who hid behind the word respected. But you're not him. Not yet. You still might not be if you make the right choice tonight. You murdered him." Philippe's voice had cracked on the words. "You buried him alive. I heard him screaming in that grave and I ran away. I left him to die because you made me choose. I made you understand that you couldn't save him without dying yourself. Yes, that's not the same as making you choose. You made your own choice based on wanting to live. That's not cowardice. That's survival. The shame you feel isn't from running. It's from understanding that part of you was glad to run, glad to be free of a man who was raising you to be just like him." Solomon had finished filling the grave, had tamped down the earth, and had finally turned to face Philippe directly. The boy had kept the rifle trained on him, but the barrel had been wavering now, the weapon growing heavy in arms that had begun to tremble. "So shoot me," Solomon had said. "Put a bullet in my chest. Tell the sheriff you killed the man who murdered your father and 11 others. They'll make you a hero. The white people in this parish will celebrate you. You'll inherit Oak Haven. You'll own all those enslaved people your father owned, and you'll become exactly what he was training you to be. Is that what you want? What else is there? He was my father. I should avenge him. Should you? Let me tell you something about vengeance, boy. I spent 40 years watching people die, burying them, listening to their families grieve. I watched men like your father treat human beings worse than animals, and I watched those human beings suffer without hope of justice or mercy. I decided that if the law wouldn't punish these men, I would. And now I've done it. I've killed 12 men who deserved killing. But do you know what I am now?" Philippe had shaken his head, unable to speak. "I'm a murderer, that's all. Not a hero, not justice incarnate, not an instrument of God's will. Just a man who killed other men because he decided their lives were worth less than his need for revenge. Maybe I was right to do it. Maybe those 12 men had forfeited their right to live. But that doesn't change what I am. And if you pull that trigger, that's what you'll become too. A killer. Someone who took another human life because he couldn't think of anything else to do with his anger and shame. Then what should I do?" The question had come out as almost a sob, years of pain compressed into 4 words. Live differently, inherit Oak Haven, and free every enslaved person on that plantation. Use your father's money to help people instead of hurting them. Prove that you're not him by becoming someone he would have hated. That's harder than pulling a trigger, boy. That's real courage. Can you do it?" For a long moment, Philippe Landry had stood there with the rifle aimed at Solomon's chest, his finger on the trigger, his whole body shaking with indecision. Everything he'd been taught, everything his father had instilled in him, had screamed that he should fire, should kill this man, should avenge the family honor. But something else, something quieter but more insistent, had whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. The rifle had lowered slowly until it pointed at the ground. Philippe had taken a shaky breath, had wiped tears from his face with his free hand, and had nodded once. "Good," Solomon had said. "Now go home. Tell them you saw nothing tonight. When the sheriff questions you, and he will, tell him that Francois Laviolette rode out alone and never came back. Tell him you have no idea what happened. Can you do that?" Another nod. "Then go. And Philippe?" Solomon had paused until the boy looked at him directly. "Thank you for not shooting me. It gives me hope that maybe things can change eventually, that maybe all this killing wasn't entirely pointless." Philippe Landry had walked away from that cemetery, had ridden home through the dark, and had kept Solomon's secret. When the authorities had questioned him about Laviolette's disappearance, he'd told exactly the lie Solomon had instructed, and no one had doubted him, because why would a 16-year-old boy lie to protect his father's killer? The disappearance of Francois Laviolette in March 1859 marked the end of Solomon Thibodeau's campaign, though it took months for the authorities to accept this. Sheriff Marcus Sutherland had organized one final massive manhunt through the swamps, had committed every available resource to capturing Solomon, and had promised that this time would be different. It hadn't been different. Solomon had vanished as completely as his 12 victims, and despite months of searching, no trace of him was found. The wound he'd sustained in his fight with Laviolette should have left a trail of blood, should have weakened him enough to make capture inevitable. But Solomon had simply melted into the landscape as if he'd never existed. The official investigations continued until March 1860, when the approaching Civil War finally drew attention away from local manhunts toward larger national concerns. The case of the 12 missing plantation owners was officially closed, with an annotation in the parish records that suggested probable death of suspect in the Bayou regions remains unrecovered due to environmental conditions. But the unofficial story, the version preserved in the songs and whispered histories of the black communities throughout southern Louisiana, told a different ending. Some said Solomon had died of his wounds in a hidden camp deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, had been buried by friends who'd never reveal his final resting place. Others claimed he'd made his way north on the Underground Railroad, had started a new life in Canada or Massachusetts under a different name. A few insisted he'd returned to the Houma people his grandmother had come from, had been absorbed back into their community and protected until his natural death years later. The truth, like so many truths from that era, remained buried deeper than any grave Solomon had ever dug. What was certain was that he was never captured, never tried, never brought to whatever justice the law of 1860 Louisiana might have provided. The 12 men he'd killed remained missing, their bodies never recovered, their fates officially unexplained, and the graves he'd prepared for them remained hidden in the swamps and ruins and hidden spaces of the bayou country, markers of a kind of justice that existed outside any legal framework. Felipe Landry kept his promise. In 1861, with the Civil War breaking out and the old social order crumbling, he quietly began freeing the enslaved people on Oak Haven Plantation, giving them land from the estate and helping them establish independent lives. He never married, never had children, never quite escaped the weight of that night in the cemetery when he'd chosen not to pull the trigger. He lived to be 73 years old and spent his entire life trying to atone for what his father had been and what he himself might have become. Father Etienne Boudreau, the parish priest who'd tried to convince Solomon to surrender, maintained until his death in 1882 that Solomon's soul had been damned by his actions, that 12 murders couldn't be justified no matter what cruelties those men had committed. But in private moments, in conversations he thought no one remembered, the priest had admitted that he'd seen more justice in Solomon Spade than in 4 decades of law enforcement and judicial proceedings. The old cemetery near Bayou Black, where so much of Solomon's work had been done, gradually fell into decay after the Civil War. The wooden markers rotted away, the graves sank and were reclaimed by undergrowth, and eventually even local residents forgot exactly where the cemetery had been. But descendants of the enslaved population continued to visit the general area, leaving small offerings, flowers, coins, pieces of cloth, at spots where they believed Solomon's victims might be buried. These pilgrimages continued into the 20th century, became part of local folklore, and eventually transformed into something almost like a tradition. In 1934, during the Great Depression, a WPA project to map historic sites in Louisiana sent researchers into Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes to document old cemeteries and landmarks. One researcher, a young black woman from New Orleans named Celeste Thibodeau, who claimed no relation to Solomon but who'd been fascinated by the story since childhood, found something remarkable in the water-damaged archives of the parish courthouse. She discovered a journal, badly deteriorated but partially legible, that had belonged to Sheriff Marcus Sutherland. In it, Sutherland had written a confession he'd apparently never intended anyone to read. He'd admitted that in April 1859, 1 month after La Violette's disappearance, he'd encountered Solomon Thibodeau at the old chapel where Sutherland had buried his own victim years earlier. Solomon had been there to dig up the freedman Sutherland had killed, to give him a proper burial. The two men had faced each other across an open grave, and Sutherland had realized in that moment that he could kill Solomon and end the manhunt as a hero. Or he could let him go and live with the knowledge of his own crimes. Sutherland had let him go. He'd watched Solomon finish his work, rebury the freedman with dignity, and walk away into the swamp. And he'd never told anyone, had continued the manhunt for months afterward purely for show, had written in his journal that perhaps the only justice in this world is the justice we make ourselves, and perhaps Solomon Thibodeau understands that better than any sheriff or judge ever could. The journal's discovery caused a minor sensation in academic circles, but was largely ignored by the general public, who'd moved on to more contemporary concerns. But it provided a kind of closure to the story, suggested that Solomon had survived his wound, had completed his work, and had simply walked away from everything, the killings, the manhunt, the fear he'd inspired, into whatever life came next. The 12 graves were never found. Searches conducted in the 1950s and again in the 1990s, using ground-penetrating radar and modern forensic techniques, located dozens of unmarked graves throughout the parishes, but couldn't definitively identify which, if any, contained the remains of the missing plantation owners. The swamps had kept their secrets, the earth had claimed its own, and the dead had remained dead. This mystery shows us that history's deepest wounds often come from the intersection of legal power and moral bankruptcy, from systems that permit atrocities while punishing resistance, from the terrible choices people face when justice becomes impossible through any legitimate means. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Were Solomon's actions justified by the circumstances, or did he become the monster he fought against? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge us to think about the darkest chapters of American history. See you in the next video.